Hey, welcome everybody. Um, and we encourage you to put your cameras on if you want, so it just feels a little bit more participatory. Um, Welcome everybody. And also, you're fine to eat lunch. I know people sometimes, oh, I'm eating lunch, I can't be on camera. It's fine. Nobody's going to be upset. Um, we're just letting people kind of filter in here, but it's great to see so many faces. And thank you to Libby and Ellen for coordinating all of this. So anyway, I think we can get started. And thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dora Mills. I think I know most people on here. And I'm very excited today to welcome Colin Woodard to our public health grand rounds, the first one of the fall season. Colin and I go back a few years, a few decades, I think by now.
Yeah.
I first knew him when he was the Portland Press Herald reporter and covered a lot of health issues. And I was running Maine CDC, and we would talk quite a bit on the phone on a number of health issues. Christine, do you have a question? I just see your hand up. Are you having trouble hearing or something? Oh, hand went down. Okay, sorry. Anyway, but Colin is also, I'm from, as some of you know, Colin's from Maine. And we're both kind of hail to some degree or another from Franklin County area.
That's right. Go Farmington.
Farmington. So, and I know there are people here from that neck of the woods as well. But Colin, anyways, has an illustrious career. It's really been pretty amazing. And you can maybe also kind of summarize some of it as well for me, but you end up spending time, you went to Tufts University, one thing, but you spent time as a young adult over in Eastern Europe. And then writing quite a bit about that. He was also a correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, as well as some other newspapers. And almost 20 years ago, you wrote The Lobster Coast, which is what I first remember knowing Colin's writing, besides the Portland Press Herald. And he's really evolved. You've had a number of chapters in your life from covering the strife in Eastern Europe to writing about your home state and to writing as a journalist in different newspapers. But you also, Colin has now left the Portland Press Herald several years ago, and is a visiting scholar. You're now at the, oh my gosh, I'm just trying to find it, the director of Nationhood Lab at Salve Regina University's Pell Center, where he's researching the health outcomes from a very unique regional perspective. And that's why we asked him to share some time with us today. And he's also been working on a lot of democracy-related issues too. So, and he lives not far from Portland with his wife and two children. So welcome, Colin. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to pass the baton to you. And people, also, I just want to mention too that if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. Also, we will be monitoring the chat, and also we'll have time for questions. You can unmute as well, raise your hand, and ask some questions. I don't know if you want questions after you present, Colin, or during presentation, it doesn't matter, but you let us know. So.
Sure.
The baton to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dora, and thanks for inviting me, and for all of you at MaineHealth for attending. You might ask, what's a historian, an international relations guy who writes on regional cultures doing speaking to you in a medical clinical hard science forum? I'm kind of the result of applied liberal arts major, I guess you would say. I went to Mount Abram High School up in Western Maine. I went to Tufts University. And I graduated from high school in '87, so that was at the height of Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost. I thought that would be an interesting part of the world to study because it seemed like something might change. So I was concentrating on that, and that resulted in my spending my junior year abroad in Budapest, Hungary, behind the Iron Curtain in the fall of 1989 when communism collapsed. While I was there, I saw all those events firsthand, Berlin Wall falling, Prague Spring, all of the rest, and went back the following summer to continue seeing what was going to happen in Romania, and then basically spent most of my 20s in the 1990s in that region. I picked up journalism as a way to be able to stay there, travel around and see what would happen, but I'd been studying the stuff, and so everything from the collapse of, communism and totalitarian regimes to efforts to try to create liberal democracies where none had existed before, descents into fascism and ethnic conflict in some parts of the world, battles over historical memory and who we are, who belongs, who doesn't, what's it mean to be a Hungarian, a Pole. And that was all the stuff I was studying. I went back in the middle for a year, did a master's degree at the University of Chicago in international relations, studying that stuff. But the throughput was how people, how culture works, how it gets transmitted, how do ideas about who you're supposed to be and your identity, especially your national identity or your national minority identity, and how that plays out and affects events on the ground. Because when I was in Bosnia covering the aftermath of that conflict, the stakes are very real, and those kind of things and the way they imprint on people and get transmitted through cultures are vital. So that's kind of the throughput of what I've done in my whole career. I was a foreign correspondent all over the place, and then I was at the Press Herald and was the investigative reporter. But the throughput is, understanding authoritarianism, understanding what makes a healthy society, how democracies click, and trying to understand the relationship between those elements. So I founded, my books orbit around that in one way or another. What ties Lobster Coast and American Nations and the new book coming out, Nations Apart, together is that they all follow how history, the past informs our present, how identity and story and stuff shift and create the realities we're in and what we can do about it. And so I entered academia by founding Nationhood Lab, which is a project at the research center, the Pell Center at Salve Regina University down in Newport, Rhode Island. We study the problems of United States nationhood and try to solve them. So, no problem. We got it all covered. That includes efforts to protect the liberal democratic tradition from authoritarian ethno-nationalism of the varieties that I experienced in the Balkans. So how did that get me to you? Well, I will tell you shortly and you'll see how it unpacks, but the differences, we're a federation of rival regional cultures, and that has an enormous effect on health. And I ended up in a collaboration with researchers out in other parts of the country who saw the work we were doing and we see this spatial pattern, let's run the numbers together and collaborate. And here we are 2 years later with 28 published peer-reviewed articles, all in you folks' fields, cardiology and medicine and public health and stuff. I'm often the caboose in the author list, but occasionally they let me write a lead paper. And I'm going to explain what I and my more sciencey, hard sciencey collaborators have learned in doing all this. So I'm going to introduce to you, and in the meantime, try to see if we can make Microsoft Teams show you my slide deck. I think we decided share window worked better, and I want this window. Can you all see this? Is that a yes? Anyone?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Fantastic.
Yes. Thank you.
As long as you can see it. All right. So I'm here to present an essential framework for understanding recurrent geospatial patterns in a wide range of phenomenon in American life, past and present, a framework that maps the post-conquest regional cultures of our continent. I'm going to then briefly describe how these regional cultures influence politics, economics, immigration, violence, and many other things. And then I will present to you the peer-reviewed findings I was just mentioning on the impacts all of this has on health outcomes and wellness from my ongoing collaboration with my research partners, physiologist Rossa Rayner from the University of Illinois, Chicago, Nico Pronk, president and CEO of Health Partners Institute in Minneapolis. Health Partners, think of it as the MaineHealth of Minnesota, and they actually have their own little think tank doing, I guess, more or less what Dora Ann's brief is at MaineHealth, but they actually have a whole unit of researchers working on that, and a shifting cast of other co-authors a wide range of people depending on what we're studying, cardiologists, public health researchers. We even had a biomechanical engineer at one point, a renowned UCLA health economist, and in the spirit of holistic care, even a dentist or two. This 2-year collaboration has 28, I guess it is, peer-reviewed journals articles so far, with more on the way. So to begin, if we can advance this slide successfully, there we go. The regional framework I'm about to present comes out of the work of history that I did about 14 years ago that's received a lot of attention. This is the cover of it, American Nations, which lays out a number of structural facts about our country that have to be understood if one is to make any sense of it in health or much else besides. American Nations is a book about North American regionalism and the vital importance it plays in understanding our history, our national identity, our current political cleavages, which are geographic even as they are ideological. It's primarily a work of history, but academically, it's built on the foundation of the late cultural geographer Wilbur Zielinski's doctrine of first effective settlement, which said, it was articulated in 1973, and it said, whenever an empty territory undergoes settlement or an earlier population is dislodged by invaders, the specific characteristics of the first group able to effect a viable, self-perpetuating society are of crucial significance for the later social and cultural geography of the area, no matter how tiny the initial band of settlers may have been. In other words, they sort of format the cultural hard drive, if you will, creating the conditions the rest of us encounter as a fait accompli. We can wrestle with those conditions, we can adapt to it, we can alter them at least at the margins, but it's a thing with actual power that's transmitted to individuals through institutions and social learning and rituals and stories in families and schools and churches and through the law and norms and such of that place, or in our case, region. The United States' central vulnerability, the United States' central vulnerability is that it started as an ad hoc sort of rebel alliance of completely different colonial cultures, most of which were already a century old in 1776. 3, 6, even 8 generations old at the time of the Revolution, with settlement zones, exclusive settlement zones, segmenting the eastern coastal plain and Appalachian highlands of what's now the United States. The point I'm making in all this is we're not a nation state at all. We never have been. We're a collection of stateless nations, if you will, each with their own intense ideals and stories of national purpose. The original clusters of colonies were settled in the 17th and early 18th centuries by people from distinct regions of the British Isles and from France and the Netherlands and Spain, each with their own religious, political, and ethnographic characteristics. Each was colonized at a separate time and under a different political model. Some of these regions championed individualism, others, utopian social reform. Some embraced an Anglo-Protestant identity, others, ethnic and religious pluralism. Some valued equality and democratic participation, others, deference to an aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. The Puritan project here in New England had little in common with the neo-feudal aristocratic society of the Chesapeake country, or the Dutch commercial colony encompassing what's today the greater New York City, or New Spain's far-flung northern frontier, or the West Indies Slave Society planted in the deep southern lowlands by English planters from Barbados who had run out of room on their own island. For generations, these discrete Euro-American colonizer cultures developed in remarkable isolation from one another, consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and expanding across the eastern half of this continent in nearly exclusive settlement bands. They saw themselves as competitors for land, for settlers, for capital, and even as enemies. I mean, these regions were on the opposing sides of the English Civil War, the 1640s, of the Glorious Revolution in 1688-89, in the American Revolution, in the War of 1812, and indeed, and most obviously, in the Civil War. This, by the way, is a map of the Spanish colonization of the Southwest, the areas that were actually settled like boots on the ground as opposed to just on paper prior to the US annexations. But the point I'm making is that there's never been an America, but rather several Americas. And there are 12 within the United States' current borders, 9 major regions and 4 enclaves, extensions of regional cultures that lie primarily in Canada, Greenland, the Caribbean, or Oceania. To see their effect, you have to use county level data. That's the resolution level you're seeing here. Canadian statistical districts in Canada, Mexican states in Mexico. These regional cultures, which don't respect state or even international boundaries, have never been in agreement on the really big questions in American life, like what's the proper role of government? What's a proper balance between church and state? Or even the meaning of such key words in our lexicon as freedom or liberty. So what are these nations I'm talking about? Well, you have Yankeedom, say, in the dark blue you see there, the greater New England cultural space, founded by the Puritans, a people who believed that they were in a covenanted relationship with God, like the Old Testament Hebrews, and they had been tasked by God to do specific things in this world on his behalf. An errand in the wilderness, a light on a hill, a people with a mission. And this is critical for the evolution of the society, they would be punished and rewarded as a group for how well they did towards this Calvinist utopia they were making. And thus were in a communal project to accomplish goals via their shared institutions. Contrast that with, say, the Tidewater, which you see down in the Chesapeake country, which was founded by English settlers at roughly the same time, but where the colonizer leadership fell to a very different group of people. They were the second and third and fifth sons of English gentry, of the big English country manor families, the ones who would not be inheriting the manor. That would go to the first brother. But the discovery of the New World had allowed them to imagine creating new manors on the other side of the ocean. And so they set about doing exactly that in the 1600s, trying to replicate the manorial society of the English countryside, only with indentured servants and later slaves filling in for the role of the serfs. Hierarchical, fundamentally conservative, embracing an aristocratic model for society that was anathema to New Englanders in the 17th century. They were trying to create like the 17th century version of Downton Abbey, if you will, right? They were the lords who were enlightened and naturally felt responsibility for the hands underneath them, but clearly they ought to be in charge. Not to mention the Dutch settled area, that light blue area around New York City, that's a commercial, globalized city-state, and it has been since its village beginnings as New Amsterdam. Multi-ethnic, multi-religious, disinterested in the great moral questions that consumed the Yankees, but committed to the freedom of conscience and inquiry in a way that the Yankees would never have contemplated, but which paralyzed Golden Age Amsterdam from which they had sprung. Or the Scots-Irish dominated upland frontiers. You see them in fire engine red there. People from the war-torn borderlands of the British Isles with their own aversion to institutions and outside control, and a deep commitment to individual liberty and personal autonomy. Or the Spanish-settled borderlands, the Quaker-influenced Midlands, communitarian but suspicious of top-down solutions. The West Indies Slave Society, transplanted to the Carolinas by English slave lords from Barbados, and so on and so forth. And just understand, these maps depict settlement patterns via Zelensky. That's all this is. So just to take the Yankeedom example, I could tell you a story about each of these places, but just for Yankeedom, so the begins with the Winthrop's Great White Fleet in the 1630s. The Puritans arrive at Massachusetts Bay. They quickly set up their own society. They're light on a hill. They forcibly annex the old colony of the Pilgrims on Cape Cod and our strange royalist settlements that Ferdinando Gorges had set up in the province of Maine. Then they moved on to pull New Hampshire and Connecticut and the rest of New England into their orbit. And then in the 1670s, the Dutch were defeated by the English in a big, global conflict. And as a result, New Amsterdam became New York and New Netherland became New York State, or the province of New York. And that raised a problem because immediately Massachusetts raised their hand and said, wait a minute, much of upstate New York belongs to us. Well, how could that be? If you think back, remember in your middle school history, you'd sometimes see a map of the 13 colonies, and the map would look more or less like the 13 states do today, except that some of the colonies would have these, colony-wide strips extending all the way to the Pacific Ocean. What's up with that? Well, these charters from the colonial period would say, my colony begins, with Farmer Wilson's tree and ends with that rock over there and extends all the way to the next ocean to the west. And the problem was they didn't realize just how far away the next ocean was going to be. But legally speaking, they own these strips of territory as wide as their colony that went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So when the Dutch were defeated, suddenly Massachusetts said, hey, wait a minute, now that we're under English law, this Massachusettsian-wide strip of millions of acres of upstate New York belonged to us. Well, they lost that argument because, the province of New York was named for the Duke of York, who was the owner of the new province, and he was the brother of the king. So Massachusetts lost that argument. But by way of compensation, they were given not sovereignty, but land title to all that disputed land, which the Commonwealth of Massachusetts allowed designated, sort of approved Presbyterian and congregational ministers to lead entire family groups from one town to go redeploy New England style villages across this new frontier with their taxpayer financed public school at one end of the town green and the meeting house at the other. You can see when you drive throughout that massive strip of much of upstate New York, you can see when you go into the old town villages, they are very similar to New England ones because that's where the initial colonizers came from. Fast forward into the early Republic period, and the Ohio Territory was being carved out by the federal government, and all of this played out again. You see that little Yankeedom dark blue segment there up against Lake Erie? That's the Western Reserve of Connecticut, because Connecticut made a claim for a Connecticutian-wide strip going out to the Pacific, and they claimed that chunk of the new Ohio Territory was their Western Reserve. Federal government said, no, it's going to be the state of Ohio, not Western Connecticut, but we will let you have land title. And so that part of Ohio, and only that part of Ohio, was settled by New Englanders, bringing along their institutions and norms and values and town planning and all the rest. In fact, go to Michigan, a generation later, same thing. Michigan was timber country. Where would you go in the 19th century to find people who had mastered the latest state-of-the-art timber and lumber trade technologies that had all been mastered in northern Maine, Bangor and north? And so huge numbers of the people manning the lumber camps were Mainers going straight down the Erie Canal to Michigan. But the people who were running the show, so to speak, the elite who were writing the territorial and state constitutions, attending the conventions, filling up the legislature and being the governors and such, were from the Yankee settled upstate of New York, the Yankee settled Western Reserve of Ohio, or New England itself, which provided something like 4 of the first 5 territorial and state governors of Michigan. Same story for Wisconsin later on, and Minnesota and these other areas. So in other words, this is the area that was colonized by New Englanders and their descendants, carrying in much of assumptions and cultural norms about the world. And we could tell the same story as we went along, but that's how this map is constructed and what you're seeing. So the effect of these regional cultures on American history and society have been profound. The map you see here is echoed in the battle lines of the English Civil War of the 1640s, in the War of 1812, in the American Revolution, in the debates in Congress leading up to the US Civil War, in the culture wars of the 1960s, and indeed in almost every single hotly contested presidential election in our history. Check it out. Because to really see the cleavages, you have to look at not a blue state, red state map, but a blue county, red county map, and you can see all of that. You can see that one party is dominating Yankeedom and the left coast. You can see it's kind of mixed in the Midlands, which is always our swing region. And you can see this massive monochrome one-party block throughout the Deep South, Tidewater, much of Far West, and Greater Appalachia. And no, I didn't mess with the colors. Red really is Republican and blue really is Democrat, because if you look closely, this is not a recent election. This is the 1916 showdown between Woodrow Wilson and Charles Hughes. And that brings us to the 2008 map, Barack Obama versus John McCain. You can see it's pretty much the same map, right? Except that the colors and the parties have switched. That's because the parties had switched identities, ideologies, and constituencies between those time periods, and particularly between 1965 and about 2005 or so. It's a fool's errand to try to understand the US political history through the lens of parties, because first of all, parties come and go, where the Whigs and Federalists today, but also parties can and do completely invert, as our two major parties have lately. But this goes way beyond politics. The presence of these regional cultures profoundly affected 19th century immigration. This, from Census Bureau data, is the percentage of foreign-born people in 1900, because the census takers asked every single person, hey, you foreign-born or not? And they recorded it, and people have been able to have individualized, solid data on exactly where they were. Notice that nobody went to the Deep South, Tidewater, and Greater Appalachia, further reinforcing identity and geographic differences. 1% in Tidewater and Deep South were foreign-born, compared to 31 in New Netherland, almost 24 in Yankeedom, over 25 in the left coast, and so on. This, in turn, affected the distribution of religious traditions. Here, from the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies, U.S. Religion Census, are the dominant religions in each county today. There's that red zone is Southern Baptist. You can see a Lima green kind of Methodist belt going through the Midlands. Gray is LDS, or the Mormons, and blue is Catholic, the largest religious group amid that great 1880 to 1924 immigration wave that so profoundly changed ideas about American identity, forcing legacy Protestant America to accept that henceforth Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, at least, would be full-fledged Americans. Except none of that happened in those southern regions. That Baptist zone you see there is the legacy of the spatial maldistribution of that great immigration wave, and is also the only part of the country where Christian nationalism, those are in capitals, that's a political, not a religious notion, that America is rightly an evangelical Protestant nation created by and for evangelical Protestants, can find further soil. Because in any other region of the country, people look around and it's just obviously not the case, and hasn't been for 6 or 7 generations. Here, not unrelated, is a detailed crowdsourced map of American dialects today by the internet researcher Rick Ashman. And notice that the major domains in dark blue follow the American nation's settlement patterns to a remarkable extent. And there's even a genetic imprint. This study came out in 2017, 6 years after American Nations did, in the journal Nature Communications. Scientists at Ancestry.com mapped the genomes of 770,000 Americans gathered in their testing kits with their genealogies to find reproductive clustering. And you can see that it follows the American Nations map to a surprising extent, even though American Nations is not about bloodline and genetics at all. It's about cultural transmission, but it also left this genetic blueprint. You can see Greater Appalachia split on that purple and red on the two sides of the Appalachian ridges into two settlement streams that then merged out by the Ozarks. One seminal difference between the regions that's important for today's discussion. They've never agreed on how to go about the American experiment. How to create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free. Do you emphasize individual liberty or the common good, the building and maintenance of a free society? Our politics, up until 2016 anyway, have centered on this question, which is why you see the American Nations map reflected in all those county level election results I showed you earlier. You can see here that the big difference between the regions is, are they communitarian or individualistic? And these are coded by their ideological character in a sort of 4-tier structure we use. You can see that the individualistic nations in shades of purple are Deep South, Greater Appalachia, the far interior West, and legacy Tidewater. And they've until now voted almost always for the more individualistic party. That would be the Jeffersonians in the 1810s, the Jacksonian Democrats in the antebellum period, white supremacist Democrats from the 1860s to roughly the 1960s, Republicans today. The communitarian ones, Yankeedom, New Netherland, Midlands, Left Coast, El Norte, are voting for the more communitarian party, which would be the Federalists in the 1810s, the Whigs in the 1830s, Lincolnian Republicans from the 1860s to the 1960s, and Democrats today. The regional and ideological divide, especially this individualism, communitarianism thing, greatly affected the response to a contagious, deadly airborne virus. You can see how the individual liberty nations I just showed you hobbled the US response to the COVID-19 pandemic. They resisted mask wearing, both at the public official level and the public compliance level, and vaccine uptake, which the latter is mapped here by Nationhood Lab by regional culture as of August 15th, 2021. I picked that because, as many of you probably recall, that would be a time when vaccines had finally been not only available, but you could actually get them, and it had been true for quite a few weeks. If you weren't vaccinated by then, either you couldn't for medical reasons, or it was not a priority, or you really didn't want to. So at that time, notice that some of the communitarian nations like Left Coast or Yankeedom have vaccine rates at a per capita level almost double that of the Deep South. And not unrelated, these are the county level death rates from the New York Times from the end of that same summer. My academic collaborators and I recently calculated the final death tallies from the Centers for Disease Control. As some of you probably know, they called February 23rd, 2023 the end, statistically speaking. At that point, the Deep South had lost 505 people per 100,000 residents to COVID-19. That's almost 250,000 dead. And that's 2.5 times the per capita death rate in the left coast, 195 per 100,000, and 5 times that of Hawaii, which is part of the greater Polynesian cultural space, which, because it was an island, was able to largely seal itself off and provides us a control sample for what might have been possible. At the top left here in this graphic, by the way, are the regional COVID-19 primary vaccination rates as of that day in February 2023. It's probably roughly where we are now in percentage terms. Florida's data is missing there, but I wouldn't shift it by too much. I predict that the delta between the regions will rapidly grow as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Structure of the CDC and trust in vaccines leave a state-level patchwork in which these state-level cultural responses, regional cultural responses, will become more and more influential. The communitarian individualistic divide affects where the uninsured live. Red is the highest. Notice the regional variations within states in places like Virginia, Ohio, Louisiana, California. This despite the fact that insurance policies are set at the state level. And this is life expectancy from a package in Politico story we published in 2023. We found a 3 to 5 year population level difference between the regions. That might not sound like a lot, but that's comparable to the difference in the life expectancy rates between the United States and Bulgaria, Libya, and the Philippines, respectively. And these gaps persisted when looking at just urban counties, like just urban counties in this region versus urban ones in that one, or just rural counties, or just rich ones, or just poor ones, or just ones with high education levels, or just ones with low education levels, and with some interesting rank shifts by race. Rarely appreciated is how much the incidence of gun violence, like so many other salient issues in American life, varies by region. Here, again, using CDC data, back when there was such things, are the per capita rates for gun deaths by county between 2010 and 2020 cumulative, as we mapped here at Nationhood Lab. The difference between Yankeedom at 8.6 and the Deep South at 15 per 100,000 is nearly 2 to 1. And New Netherland, again, the area, the Dutch settled zone around New York City, is the safest place on the continent by far, with about 1/4 of the Deep South's rate, right? Remember, this is the most diverse and densely populated part of the entire continent. Just for comparison, 8.6 says, for Yankeedom, Japan's rate in 2017 was 0.06. So theoretically, there's room for improvement for humans and guns. And this is the white-only gun homicide rates by county. The differences between the Deep South at 2.8 and Greater Appalachia at 2.2 are roughly triple Yankeedom's at 0.8 and 5 to 6 times that of New Netherland at 0.5, which is, by the way, about the same as the overall gun homicide rate for Canada. For comparison speakings, these are the white-only gun suicide rates. Notice that the far west, here in the previous slide, goes from being one of the really bad areas, going from the really safe areas to one of the most deadly, a pattern that you don't see in any other regional cultures, but which raises interesting questions for what is going on for researchers who work in that. And here, not unrelated to some of the above, is every fatal white supremacist mob action in the United States between 1835 and 1964, both lynchings and race riots, as mapped by the Monroe Works Today research group. The orange dots represent an incident where an African American was killed, and the yellowish ones are Latino victims. These, from the Washington Post, are FICO credit scores by county. Blue is bad, gold is good. Consider there are lots of very, very rich countries in that counties in that blue blob, and lots of very poor ones in the gold one, like Washington County here in Maine, right? Often said to be one of the poorest in the entire Northeast of the United States. Compare also, like, look in Ohio, compare urban Cleveland with urban Cincinnati, suburbs and all. Why would that be other than cultural? We found the data underlying this Washington Post map and ran the calculations for the median FICO scores by each region. The differences were significant. The left coast's average median FICO score was 737, Yankeedom's 723, Greater Appalachia's 688, and the Deep South's just 674. So what was driving these disparities? We were kind of curious, and these are things that affect health too. We looked to the rich county level data from the Urban Institute's Debt in America project to get a sense of where the drivers of debt and distress were. This map depicts the percentage of borrowers in each county 60 days or more delinquent on an auto loan or lease of a retail installment plan loan as of August 2023. We chose this metric because it's a pretty good one, because this is generally bad debt in the sense that it's not debt incurred for an appreciating asset like a home or education. As you can see, there's a more than 2-to-1 difference in the share of delinquent borrowers from Yankeedom and left coast as compared to the Deep South. We also looked at the share of people who had medical debt in collections. It revealed a similar pattern, with New France, Deep South, and Greater Appalachia all coming in with more than double the rate in Yankeedom and more than triple the rate in New Netherland or left coast. Which brings us finally to the peer-reviewed work that Ross Arena, Nico Pronk, and a shifting cast of other researchers have been doing for the past 2 years. From one of our first papers in Progress in Cardiovascular Diseases, here is the incidence of diabetes 2020 to 2022 in percentages. And this is obesity in the same period. And this is the rate of self-reported physical inactivity. Notice in all these slides, the individual liberty regions perform worse than the communitarian ones, with the exception of First Nation in Alaska. This is a very large region if you include Canada and Greenland and other parts of the continent. But for us, it's just Western and Northern Alaska. These are areas where people, indigenous people and cultures remain dominant upon the landscape and always have been, and still control their fate and are able to live in their regions through the adaptations they've had over the centuries. And for this, in a study in the American Journal of Medicine, we took up the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, a tool that employs 16 census variables to determine each U.S. county's likely resiliency in the face of an external disaster. And then we did call that data and we used it to calculate the relative SVI, social vulnerability, of each of the American nation's regions. Factors used by the CDC to make the SVI include household socioeconomic indicators, household types and characteristics, access to transportation, the presence of racial minorities and non-English speakers, because I guess that's supposed to complicate your disaster efforts if you have communications difficulties. The results, shown in the figure below, follow what the American nation's model might predict. Individualistic regions, with their long historic track records of low taxes, weak regulations, and light investment in social programs and public goods, have poor SVI scores, as does First Nation. Communitarian Yankeedom, a region with a long tradition of communitarian public investment, has the best SVI score of 7.5, which is about 25% better than that of El Norte at 10. The Midlands score of 7.6 and the left coast are just behind Yankeedom. Incidentally, SVI penalizes in its metrics diverse high-density areas, which explains why New Netherland and Hawaii, the greater Polynesian space, have relatively low scores. And this paper, from Current Problems in Cardiology, looked at two metrics of preventable dental problems: children who don't ever see a dentist and senior citizens who've had all of their teeth removed by the time they're 65. This slide, the slides you see here, one of the nation overall and one of the counties composing that data, is showing you the children with about an 11% difference between Yankeedom and Deep South's metric on that. We found and published about similar regional variations and patterns in the prevalence of disabilities, sleep disorders, arthritis, depression, food deserts, food insecurity, and a lifestyle health index that Dr. Arena developed. We found evidence for a link between gun violence and physical inactivity at the county level, and also between county level lifestyle health index scores and voter turnout. Which brings us to this paper, led by Nico Pronk, which first summarizes our evidence for cultural determinants of health. The basic idea is that cultural values begat political preferences, which in turn create the policy environment, which begats the social determinants of health, which plays a massive role in population-level health outcomes. It then shows that the relationships interact in a complex adaptative system, an ecosystem, if you will, where the multiple levels are interactive and interdependent. The downstream levels in this model are behaviors and risk factors. The upstream levels are the environment. That's the forcing factors that relate to populations, not individuals. This is one of several articles in a special issue of Progress in Cardiovascular Diseases, published a couple months ago. In the same issue, you'll find this paper, where I'm not in the caboose for once in the author list. I laid out the American nations model in proper detail and methodology for the use by medical and health science audiences like yourselves. And with that, I thank you for your patience and attention, and I look forward to your questions. Let's see if I can make see all of you again. Hi.
There have been several comments talking about what fascinating data these are. So thank you so much. That was a fascinating run through of all these data. First of all, I just want to note that, and behind you, I see, is that an original poster from Blaine's?
Yeah, that's a banner of Blaine
president?
Logan's 1886 presidential run. Yeah.
So for those, Blaine, James G. Blaine, I think he was the only Mainer ever to be nominated for president, or to be running for president. I mean, because Margaret T. Smith was nominated, but not. But anyway, he was on the ticket.
Staggeringly corrupt, yeah.
Yeah, he lost.
James G. Blaine, continental liar from the state of Maine, was the phrase back then.
I think he was the only Republican to lose during quite a few years of.
Yeah, and he was House Speaker. He was a very powerful figure in the Grant administration and thereafter.
So wait, I didn't note that because I was like, oh, look at that Blaine versus.
Yeah, it's sharp eyes. I could tell.
So anyway, that was also just a little bit of a segue to get into your data too. That's just to note your Maine-based poster there, or sign. So that was fascinating. Please, anybody, please feel free to unmute and raise your hand if you can raise your hand electronically. And I'm also just making sure that there are that they were answering questions in the chat as well. So a couple questions I have. So it's fascinating to me because in public health, we have been so focused on the social determinants of health in terms of, housing and transportation and food insecurity, basically poverty leading to health issues. We've also been in racism, racial and ethnic backgrounds determining health. And then there's political determinants of health that Daniel Dawes talks about. So this to me was so fascinating because it was about cultural determinants of health based on a lot of the early settlers in each area of the state, of the country. And I know, having lived in other parts of the country, you can feel that. And I know when You can see with COVID, like Minnesota has got that very strong, as you said, commonalities in terms of being, a strong desire to look out for each other. And
Yeah, you
you have it
saw
in
it
Maine.
at I mean, I'm actually putting together, because of what RFK Jr. is doing right now, putting together a new post right now, right after I get off the call. It should get up later today, reviewing the pandemic. I mean, that slide I showed you, but the New York Times, in the early days, we had to stop moving. We don't have a vaccine. We don't know what this is. They track cell phone data and at a county level to see who stopped and who didn't. Follows the pattern perfectly. And then who didn't, like what were the death rates after that? Then who got vaccinated early on? Then who died after that? Then what are the rates today? What was the public health advice? And it's but the argument was not we don't trust the vaccines in those regions. It was they're taking away your freedom, that it is tyranny, that you can't go to church or you can't wear your masks. It was immediately an individual liberty argument, not a scientific one, because it goes deep to the idea of personal autonomy and liberty, and that you don't necessarily demote that in the face of some common good, abstract need of the community. Whereas, the Puritans were insisting on that, individuals don't have, off to the stock with you if you don't do what we say. So it was a very different sort of baked in cultural environment.
So it does seem like it's a fascinating layer of determinants of health that you've added to the conversation of social determinants, political determinants, other determinants. So I have two questions. One is, so what's next? Like, what do we do about it?
Yeah.
Is it just something that we conclude into our repertoire? So we take into account the cultural determinants and how we determine strategies. A second question, so I'm going to blast out several questions, and please, anybody else, please raise your hand. So we've seen now these collaboratives forming in California, Washington, Oregon, Hawaii.
All following the American nation's predictions of who would
following
who.
These are some, and for people don't know, these are the collaboratives forming around the COVID vaccine, and Maine is part of a collaborative that's in the East Coast, bluish states, for lack of a better term. So, kind of also like predictions, is that where is that going to go? And then a third question is just, I mean, even within Maine, I mean, you and I from Franklin County, I shift gears when I drive from the greater Portland up to Franklin County. There is a shift in culture even within these areas. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that and have you comment on that. So I just threw out the very variety of questions.
I mean, in like speaking on the cultural geographer hat on, the cultures these are the dominant cultures, and you have spheres and domains of influence. You'll have blurs of, New France and the Yankeedom on the edges here and there. But you can have enclaves of all sorts that are coherent over a space, be it the Navajo Reservation or, the lost Acadian village of Shetty Camp on Cape Breton, or, the Highland Scots of Cape Fear, North Carolina. These are enclaves embedded in another regional culture. But the key is that they don't control the policy environment around them. They have to negotiate like sort of a minority enclave with the dominant culture that's around them, and they're not calling the shots in the territory. So that's kind of the way of thinking about it. Of course, anywhere you go to a unitary state like France or Italy, there is enormous variation of all sorts, or Romania or Hungary. There are Slovak villages in Hungary, and gypsy villages in Hungary, and different dialects of gypsy villages, and there's that diversity everywhere that humans go. And absolutely. But if you want to talk about the national level cultures, and there is something that is German that is across the German cultural sphere versus France. In our country, my argument is just there is not one American culture. We're a federation of these regional cultures, just as is Canada and just as is Mexico, with a different mix. And you can only understand our regional divides and why we have them, and why we can't agree on fundamental things that most liberal democracies can. What's your consensus on the relationship between church and state? Swedes can pull it together, Japanese, no, broadly speaking. We have a hard time because we're this federation, and the differences between the regional cultures from the 1770s onward are profound, which is why our national life is so fractious, and why we fought a civil war, why we have this bizarre constitutional arrangements, are all tied back to that. So as it applies to health, though, I mean, my collaborators are in your sphere and can speak expertly, so I am parroting them through the work we've done together. But their central messages are, I mean, my understanding is that in your realms, that the cultural factors that affect how people will respond to a clinician's advice, how they interpret that advice, how they eat, if you have a nutritionist, what food sets they do and don't have, all those things can vary widely between cultures. And your interventions won't necessarily be successful, or maybe your interventions are wrong-headed if you understand the cultural space better. And this is usually at the state that public health has brought this on, is usually like, how do you deal with minority community? Oh, I have an immigrant community, and how do I can't seem to change the health behaviors of people from community X. What do I do? But this applies across countries, and is starting to be recognized in the literature that there are these powerful cultural determinants that might explain why you, like my co-authors, they're physiologists. Ross Arena is the head of the physical therapy program. He is very focused on, people are inactive, they're getting diabetes and heart disease and everything else. If you can change their activity level, that's like the one thing that would most change the overall metric in your community. But like the efforts to get people to do it so far haven't budged the needle at all. I mean, the data shows that the status quo is completely failing. And so he would say, part of it may be that if you don't understand the difference in these regional cultures too, you may not be crafting the right message. A one-size-fits-all approach probably doesn't work at the city level with your diverse communities, but it also doesn't work at the regional level. MaineHealth's approach in Maine would probably have to run on a different playbook than, your equivalent, probably corporate for-profit rapacious hospital network in Alabama. They would have to have a different playbook to be successful. Whereas I'm speaking on a grand rounds out in Minnesota next week with the Health Partners folks who are having me out. Their playbook would probably be very similar in Maine. Why? There's the general Yankee cultural sphere has broadly similar assumptions. The health networks are similar. The COVID-19 response rates were similar. So is your diabetes and gun violence rates. And there's a reason for that. So it boils down to culture. So messages matter. One size fits all doesn't. And understanding and bringing in what history, geography, social science, anthropologists, whatever know, maybe actually help with problems that otherwise seem to be intractable about how to intervene and help your patients in a clinical setting. At a broader level, I would say that all of the research we've done, no matter what we look at, points in the same direction, which is, libertarian economic perspective of low taxes, low regulation, few social investments, less, little infrastructure, kills everybody, right? People report being less happy, they die quicker, they're, more likely to be shot and killed, they're sicker on every single metric you look at. I mean, it's pretty consistent all the way across, all the way down to a county level that you could be way too, like I was in Eastern Europe, like I said, the Soviet system was horrifying, right? You go too far into individual liberty or to the communitarian thing to extreme, you end up in tyranny. It's awful. But there's a balance point, and we are not at the balance point yet. In fact, the most communitarian of our cultures, I would say probably left coast, First Nations, doesn't have real control over its affairs and health and stuff. But even, they have the best metrics. So I don't think that even left coast has reached the balance point yet. I think we have a lot of communitarian social investment space left to make a society where, the economy works better, the FICO scores are better, the debt levels are less, innovation and economic measures are better. There's a happy medium. I don't even think that, Yankeedom left coast have even reached that. So it's a realigning of the way we, think about how to achieve freedom and wealth and health and all that. And the data is not pointing in the direction of sort of your Milton Friedman kind of economist. So I'd say those are the two takeaways.
That is very helpful. Kristen does ask about how does one market public health behavior to a kind of a libertarian type of cultural area, like what we have in some parts of rural Maine, for instance. is there, I mean, maybe that's out of your scope?
Well, I mean, I would, the next step for us, I'm actually going out to Minnesota so I can meet with Ross and Nico and, their other partners and start talking about what we do next with some of that. That's not my area of expertise. I can help, like the data shows this on a cultural sphere. Why might we be seeing that? What experiments might we run to get more at it? I can add that in. But what I would say in general, when I talk about the communitarian individualistic thing, like in gun violence, for instance, or with the pandemic. I mean, your argument, if you want people to, back your gun prevention measure, whatever it is, so we won't have extended magazines and handguns, or we'll increase the registry, whatever it is. If you're in Greater Appalachia, the argument has to basically be framed, if you do X, it will help you protect your family. And in Yankeedom, you would say, if you do X, it will make your community safer. And if you reverse those messages between those regions, you would be less successful in each region. Same thing with mask wearing. The people who aren't wearing masks and getting vaccinated and are running up and coughing you in the face just to show you are taking away your freedom. They're the ones shutting us down, so we can't go to church and we can't go, to the bar and stuff. It's their, selfishly taking it all. Has to be the approach. You're messing with my personal freedom and way to go. Whereas in Yankeedom, you can make the argument we got to protect one another, and those who are weak and vulnerable, we all got to like the good Puritans, do all the things to support the shared mission that we have been tasked with. Right? That thinking goes deep. Yankeedom is a very unreligious region, but the sense of mission and shared, we all are doing something, and you don't mess with the overall project in Yankeedom. When individual liberty and the common good are in clash in Yankeedom, we're almost always tending on the common good side, right? You're not going to let somebody, wreck your town and your community for their selfish reasons. You shut that person down. Whereas in Greater Appalachia, no one trusts the institutions and those shared things. So the emphasis is on the individual standing up for their rights in a world where you must do so.
So both Gary and Jeff have similar questions or comments about kind of seems a little hopeless that we'll ever be that unified, whether we're talking about the country or the case of Jeff's asking about health systems. Do you feel hopeful given everything, or do you feeling like we're probably going to fracture even more? Or not that you can really predict anything, but
well, everything is a subset now of the survival of democracy, period. I mean, bluntly, my work is, we're doing the stuff dealing with health and medicine and all of these other things, but the other branch of our work is, I'm a sort of scholar of authoritarianism, ethno-nationalists, survival of democratic regimes. We're already living in a not functioning democracy. We're deep into the authoritarian scale and moving rapidly in that direction. Do I think that will succeed? I mean, it shouldn't, because we know from our polling and our work that we're doing in that sphere is that 80% of Americans don't want to live in an authoritarian, blood and soil, ethno-nationalist state. I mean, some of them don't realize that the people they're voting for are taking them there, but most people really don't want that. Our argument has been that America has lost its story of what makes us an Americans, United Statesians, what bonds these different regional cultures together, whatever did it. Because in the 1770s, these regional cultures, the ones on the East Coast, had to band together in an ad hoc alliance because of a change in British imperial policy. The basically the king wanted to be a real king like Louis XIV and not have to let the Puritans have their town meetings and their charter, and he wanted everybody to do what I say, and we're going to conform, and we're going to stop these local power bases and idiosyncratic things ways of doing things in the colonies. It was a threat to the cultural and political order of each of the colonies, and so to protect their own systems, they gathered together to stop the empire, and lo and behold, they'd won. Right? They blew up the Death Star, and hooray. But that meant that they were also in this thing called the United States of America together, and nobody was sure what it was or what held it together. If you ask somebody what country they're from, they would say, I'm a Massachusettsian or South Carolinian. What does it mean to be an American? That had to be invented long afterwards, like in the 1830s. And that's when this battle over, are we a blood and soil country, as intellectuals from the Deep South and Tidewater argued? Or are we a country devoted to the ideals in our founding statement as a people, the Declaration of Independence, these propositions about the natural rights of humans passed down by God or nature to, survive, to not be tyrannized, to pursue our happiness as we understand it, and to access the representative self-government that makes it all possible. The arguments of Frederick Douglass and Lincoln at Gettysburg and MLK at the Mall, that's been the clash of our history, right? That was the fight in the antebellum period. That was the Civil War and Reconstruction and Southern Redemption and Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. And the ethno-nationalists ran this country in the 1910s and 20s under Woodrow Wilson, who segregated the federal government, who passed, was there pushing for the 1924 Immigration Act that protected the Anglo-Saxon nature of the country by closing out immigration from everywhere else, where Birth of a Nation, a film celebrating the KKK's violent reimposition of white supremacy across the occupied South, was all the rage, where they were putting up all the Confederate statues we were until recently tearing down. It was a bad period. And we didn't have a federation-wide consensus that we are devoted to those civic principles in the Declaration until the 1960s, not the 1860s. It's living memory, and the battle is on again, and ethno-national authoritarian movement, which is not making any, hiding it, is now in power again. It's our clash. This is our eternal struggle, and health and, well-being, richness, the economy, debt, anything you look at, it's a subset of whether or not we band together. And by we, I mean the 80% of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. This isn't about any of that. This is about, are you for the American experiment and trying to create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free, or are you blood and soil, Herrenvolk? That's the battle. So stay tuned. I'm optimistic we will, succeed, but we need a common thread that holds the 80% of us together, because they come from segments that aren't used to thinking Liz Cheney to Liz Warren. They have nothing in common politically, except they are all devoted to the ideals in the Declaration and holding them up. And so if you go to nationwithlab.org and you skip all the science and maps that I just showed you, the other stuff is a 2-year project where we did polling, qualitative interviews to carefully develop a core narrative frame, a script for what America is, like the shared American story that 80% of us can get behind, tied to the civic values in the Declaration, that is the sort of unifying. You can't just be against that. What are you for? So that's my argument. And if people do that, then yes, all of these things are entirely possible. If we don't, in an authoritarian system, everything will be bad, right? The epidemic will be bad, the economy will be bad, human health will be bad. Stay tuned.
You've given us a tremendous amount to think about. Thank you so much, Colin. And also for those of us, who most of us are in health, public health or healthcare, it's a lot for us to think about in terms of how we message, how we take into account culture as we message, and try to message in a way that addresses all the different cultures here in Maine and New Hampshire, and make sure that we're unifying more than dividing. So,
and I will say we're going to continue working on that stuff. And I am, if any of you want to reach out because you're specifically trying to work on this stuff, especially if you want to connect with, Ross and Nico and with health partners, we're very collaborative, all of us, which is how we ended up together despite being in opposite corners of the country. Happy to connect you and, collaborate with any of you if you think your projects and your work are relevant and trying to figure out this aspect of things.
Thank you so much. You've got a lot of accolades. Comment on the chat. So
thank you all.
Tremendous amount of accolades. People are very appreciative of your time, and thank you so much, Colin. It's great to see you, and we'll see you again soon, I'm sure. And thank you. And your book is coming out, your new book, which
November 4th, Nations Apart, How Clashing Cultures Shattered
It's in the
America. Chat. Launch party November 3rd, Longfellow Books at Mechanics Hall. So all the stuff I just talked about and more is in that book too.
So you will be at Mechanics Hall. You said there's
Mechanics Hall. I don't think it's been announced yet, but the night of November 3rd, the night before the book comes out at Mechanics Hall, Longfellow Books is hosting a sort of launch party thing. I think there'll be a ticket that's like the price of buying the book.
One quick second.
It'll be a whole thing.
That's great. Well, look for it, and we'll look for it at bookstores near us, and maybe a bunch of us will show up at Mechanics Hall on November 3rd and look for that event. So thank you again for your generous time today. and your amazing data and information. So insights. Take care.
Thank you all.
Ready?
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Just take a look.